Welcome to Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our website is libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today we are discussing with Danish journalist Flemming Rose his new book, The Tyranny of Silence. Flemming Rose, in 2005, decided to commission 12 cartoon depictions of the Prophet Mohammed. What happened next is the subject of this book and the source of this interview. Flemming, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on your show.
So, I love the title of your book, The Tyranny of Silence. Who are the tyrants, and what do they not want said?
Well, the tyrants are those who, quite often with good intentions, insist that every individual in the world and also in democracies should have a right not to be offended. And one of the fundamental points in my book is that we live in a world that is getting more and more diverse in terms of culture, ethnicity, and religion. And on the other hand, we also have communications technology that means that information travels. And all of this creates space for misunderstandings and manipulations, but it also implies that people will be offended by what other people say from time to time because we become more and more different. And it means, that somebody says something, somebody will be able to come forward and say, what you just said is offensive to me, and therefore you should shut up. So this notion of following the rule, if you respect my taboo, I respect yours. If you do not offend what is me, if you do not criticize what is sensitive to me, I will not criticize what is sensitive to you. It sounds on the surface very nice and polite, but I think it will lead to the end of free speech, and it will end in a tyranny of silence, because nobody will be able to say anything that will not be offensive to somebody.
I want to go back a decade to 2005 and the events that are the subject of this book. Now, you are the foreign news editor for Jyllands-Posten, a Danish newspaper. At the time, you were the culture editor when you decided to commission these 12 cartoons. What made you want to do that? Why did you want to do that, knowing that some sort of irrational response was going to be generated in various Muslim quarters, although probably unlikely to predict what in fact did happen? But why did you want to? Why was it so important to depict Mohammed in those cartoons?
It was an issue of self-censorship in Denmark and Western Europe when it came to dealing with Islam. A Danish children's writer had written a book about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and he went public in the Danish media saying, I wrote this book, but I had big problems finding an illustrator for the book, and 3 illustrators said no, and the one who finally said yes insisted on anonymity. And that is a form of self-censorship. You do not want that to appear under your own name because you are afraid of what might happen to you because of what you said or what you draw. And that illustrator later came forward acknowledging that he had insisted on anonymity because he was afraid. And he was specifically referring to the fate of Theo van Gogh, a Dutch filmmaker who was killed in 2004 in Amsterdam by a young Dutch Muslim who felt that he had offended the Prophet or the Allah, God of the Muslims. And he also referred to the fate of Salman Rushdie, who was subjected to a death sentence, a fatwa by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989, and had to live in hiding for many years. So you had this one story about self-censorship that aroused a big debate in Denmark. And then I commissioned the cartoons to see, if there is self-censorship or not, and how they would approach this issue. But we did not make a decision to depublish yet. But in the course of just 1 or 2 weeks, there were, 5 or 6 other examples along the same lines. A museum in London that removed an installation because of fear of how Muslims might react. The same with a painting at a museum in Gothenburg, Sweden. A publishing house removed a sentence from a translation of a book by Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the Somalia-born Dutch politician who is now residing in America and who has been living in hiding for many years because of a criticism of Islam. The publishing house removed a sentence that they feared might create aggressive reactions in some quarters. There was a Danish stand-up comedian who said at the time, I have no problem mocking the Bible in front of a camera, but I'm afraid doing the same with the Quran. So he was making a distinction between the way he would treat Christianity and Islam when it comes to satire. And then finally, the Danish Prime Minister had a meeting in September 2005 with a group of imams in Denmark. And 2 of the imams came out of that meeting and said they had called on the Prime Minister to make his influence on the Danish press in order to get more positive coverage of Islam. That is basically a call for censorship, a call for using the tools of state power in order to get a specific point of view into the press. And all this happened within the course of 1 or 2 weeks. And that's why we decided to push the bottom and publish that page.
So you knew you were stepping right into the storm with the publication of these
cartoons. not in the sense, that I did not, and nobody anticipated, the kind of reaction we received. We anticipated, a debate in Denmark.
Yes.
We never expected this to become a global issue or even a cross-European issue. We expected a debate in Denmark, but nobody expected, death threats, violence, and things like that.
Talk about some of the cartoons. Describe them for us. How they depicted Mohammed, and how those depictions seemed to drive these kind of irrational responses.
Well, in the letter that I wrote to the members of Denmark's Association of Cartoonists, I laid out, this case that I began with a children's writer, and then I invited to draw the prophet as they see him.
Yeah.
So it was not an invitation to mockery and laughter. It was a very open invitation. And you can see that from the very different depictions that we received. I think, it's only 3 or 4 cartoons that in fact depicts the prophet. There are 2 cartoons, I think, making fun of the children's writer, indicating that it was a PR stunt on his behalf to sell more books.
Yeah.
To come forward. There is 1 cartoon, in fact, mocking me and my newspaper, indicating, that we are a bunch of reactionary provocateurs. There's 1 cartoon depicting the most popular anti-immigration, anti-Islam politician in Denmark, and she's being placed in a lineup as if she's a criminal in 1 cartoon. So they are very different. So it's really wrong to as some people said, this was a stereotyping of Muslims and Islam. Quite the opposite. And then there, of course, is this very famous cartoon of the prophet with a bomb in his turban and a quotation from the Quran, which I find is an adequate depiction of reality. The fact that, and also around that time, there was a debate about violence being committed in the name of Islam. We had just had the 7/7 bombings in London in July 2005, and there were other cases. And he basically made a cartoon that says, some Muslims are committing terrorism and violence in the name of their religion. And in that way, he was not stereotyping anyone. If you look at that cartoon, it's a very neutral face. There's no direct relation between the prophet and the bomb. And then you have this quotation from the Quran. It is basically targeting a doctrine. it's not targeting a group of people, and in that way, that cartoon is very different from anti-Semitic cartoons in the Arab press, and the anti-Semitic cartoons that were published in Der Stürmer, this Nazi magazine that was published in Weimar Germany and Nazi Germany in the 20s and 30s. Anti-Semitic cartoons, they depict, certain features, Jewish features, and they target a group specifically, not a doctrine, human beings. And I think that is a profound and fundamental difference between these kind of cartoons. So I don't understand, how people can label Westergaard's cartoon racist, anti-Muslim, and whatever people might say.
Inside Denmark, maybe sketch for us the repercussions, the fallout that happened after the publication, just to give listeners a sense who have probably remember but have forgotten, what happened immediately after publication. And then, of course, as you say, it doesn't go away. It keeps building and building, and then there are foreign consequences. Danish embassies are bombed or burned and things like this.
Yes, but it began very quietly, in fact. I mean, the day of the publication, I received just one phone call from a newspaper when the west of Copenhagen, who called me and said he was very dissatisfied with that publication, and they had talked about it at his mosque, and he would not sell the newspaper anymore. But as an editor, from time to time, I do get calls from angry readers who don't like what we publish in the newspaper. But that's it's quite normal. So I did not pay a lot of attention to that. And it was only, I think, 2 weeks later, there was a demonstration, about 3,000 people in Copenhagen, protesting the publication of the cartoons. It was a big story in Denmark, and the first threats came, in fact, within a week. 2 of the cartoonists had to go into hiding because the police found out that a young man was on his way from, Aarhus in Jutland to Copenhagen, and he had the private addresses of these 2 cartoonists in his pocket, and he had a big knife. But he was arrested. The fact of the matter is that I debated people who would disagree with the newspaper, not only Muslims but also other people, on TV, on radio, in public meetings, and so on and so forth. But I would say that the imams and those who wanted us to apologize and promise that we would never do this again, who called on the government to pass new laws that would outlaw these kind of things, they lost the debate in Denmark. They also petitioned the government. I think they came with 15,000 signatures to make their case. But the majority of the population was on the side of the paper, even though there was a division. That's true. So because of that, the imams decided to take their case to the Middle East, and they traveled to Egypt, and Egypt played an instrumental role in turning this into a global conflict, because in November 2005 you had a parliamentary election in Egypt, and the Mubarak government was up against the Muslim Brotherhood. And he wanted to look like the true defender of Islam, and then this case came as sent from heaven, and his ambassador in Copenhagen, in fact, made sure that these imams, when they traveled to Egypt, that they met high-level people, both in religious institutions and in government, and the same in Lebanon and Syria. So they in fact incited, and they also misrepresented their story. They did not only bring, our cartoons. They also brought far more offensive cartoons that had never been published in a Danish newspaper. But they said that they received them in private mails and anonymously. We don't know that for sure, but the fact of the matter is that they gave the impression that these very, very offensive cartoons were also published in the Danish press, and that was not the case. And they told their counterparts that Muslims are being persecuted, that they do not enjoy the same rights as other people in Denmark, which is outrageous. I mean, they do enjoy the same rights, and the cartoons, I would say, is an indication of that, because by publishing them, because we also have people making satire with other religions and other prophets. And by publishing the cartoons, we were basically saying, you don't have to accept more, you don't have to accept less, but you have to accept exactly the same as other groups in our society. And by saying so, we recognize you as equal citizens. You are not strangers, you're not foreigners, you're not just visitors. You are living in Denmark, and if you live in Denmark, there are certain rules, and we assume that you abide by those rules as everybody else.
I think this really sets us up nicely. Something you report in the book is a conversation you had with Bernard Lewis, the famed Islamic scholar, or famed scholar of Islam. And you report on this conversation the sense of the demands of, and you've been discussing the role of various Middle Eastern countries, political officials and high-level Islamic officials in those countries, criticizing Denmark for not tamping down or doing something to censor, in effect, this criticism. And you talked to him about it with Bernard Lewis. And I just want to read a couple of quotes and get your reaction. So quoting Bernard Lewis, "I have been unable to find even one example discussing non-Muslims having insulted the Prophet in a non-Muslim country. So all this trouble about non-Muslims offending the Prophet in non-Muslim countries is a completely new phenomenon without any basis in Islamic history or case law." And then you further press him on this, and he says, Bernard Lewis, quote, "I don't think anyone would say as much, but there seems to be an underlying assumption that Europe is now a part of the Islamic world, or at least is becoming as such. It is in a state in which a country can be categorized as neither infidel nor Muslim, a state in which it is populated by infidels and governed by infidels, yet has made a treaty with the Islamic State. This was the case with some countries in Europe bordering the Ottoman Empire, but it's odd inasmuch as Europe has a long tradition of insulting the Prophet, and that has never before triggered this kind of reaction, because what the infidels do in their own lands is no business of Islamic law, and yet it was in effect being made a business of Islamic law in light of your cartoons and the criticism that followed."
Exactly. Yes, and it is this notion. What I took away from the conversation with Bernard Lewis was the point he made that never before have Muslims insisted on applying Islamic law to non-Muslim countries, and especially what non-Muslims would do in non-Muslim countries. They would insist on applying Islamic law in the Islamic world, and they would also insist that people living in Islamic countries, even though they were not Muslims, would also abide to that. And he was very surprised with this new trend. And I think it is it's a struggle. It's a culture war. It's a struggle of what are the limits. And Islam is a monotheistic religion that pretends to be universal, which means that in theory it would be applicable, everywhere. So when Muslims move to Western Europe in great numbers, they bring along, their faith, and they try to practice it in Europe. And because of communication and migration, they still have contacts with their home countries. And that is exactly what happened during the cartoon crisis, that there was this alliance, between imams living in Western Europe and centers of Islam in the Middle East, be it in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, and other countries. And I think it's up to us to make clear that when you live in a democracy, you cannot impose the rules of the Sharia or the rules of Islam on society at large. That is incompatible with democracy. And I usually tell Muslims when they, tell me how offended they were by what we did, that I respect Islam, and I show my respect when I go to a mosque. When I go to a mosque, I will not bring cartoons of the Prophet, and I will behave in accordance with the rules. And if I take along my daughter, she will also be dressed in a proper manner. But outside the mosque, outside the sacred places of Muslims, they cannot ask me to follow their rules. And if they do so, as they did with the cartoons and other things, they are not asking for my respect, they are asking for my submission. And I really find that incompatible with living in a liberal democracy.
Yeah, of course, as I read that quote from Bernard Lewis, I think of, I think what I have said in response. I think my basic understanding of Islam is the lack of separation between the political sphere and the religious sphere. That is to say, the law of Islam encompasses both, the law of the Ummah, of the faithful Muslim community. And so thinking further through Lewis's comments, the logic would seem to suggest that Muslims living in Europe might see this as an expansion of Islam. And if there's no separation between the political and religious spheres, then they're actually making a claim, a very aggressive claim. But I just, as I say that, I'm just kind of thinking through what he said. I want to ask, were you surprised at who some of your opponents were? And you report in the book participating in International Human Rights Day in late 2005, I think it was. Amnesty International.
December 10th, that's in fact the International Human Rights Day. Yeah.
Okay. And Amnesty International, I think, had sponsored this particular event, and you report being criticized roundly at the event by representatives of these various humanitarian organizations, all of which position themselves on the side of the oppressed. So in many, what you experienced here, and I think throughout the fallout, was opposition from progressives, which is something new, I think.
Yeah, I was dumbfounded, flabbergasted by the reactions I received at that public meeting. I was invited to talk about victims of free speech. And I talked about, poets being killed in the Soviet Union. I talked about Solzhenitsyn. I talked about Theo van Gogh. I talked about Salman Rushdie. And one person raised and said, "Oh, no, these people are not victims of free speech. This is about, a totalitarian society." Victims of free speech, it's, for instance, those who are being subjected to offense in a democracy. And I was really, I was amazed by this kind of reactions. And I made the point. Well, maybe we also should talk about the victims of free education, or victims of the welfare state, or victims of the right to freedom of religion, and so on and so forth. So I think, basically, these progressives have turned things upside down in a very counterproductive and destructive way, even though they think that they are doing this in the name of civil liberties and human rights. I believe, in fact, that they are undermining human rights. Because I think it is a fundamental right that people have a right to speak their mind, and I don't think that the kind of hate speech laws and other kind of limitations that they would like to impose on free speech promote this fundamental value. Quite the opposite.
The progressive response or opposition you experienced, in my mind, links up with something you write about later in the book, and that is, you call it the second order of tolerance, and that is to say European democracies deal with Muslims or deal with other minority groups as groups. They don't deal with them as individuals, which in fact is to undermine or to ignore, compromise a deep commitment to individual rights on its face. And I think about the opposition you experienced, and that's because you offended the group. And the group is what matters, whereas if the group isn't what matters, then it's individuals within a group defining their own space, their own meaning, and you should be able to speak to them, and they're saying no, the community is what matters. And of course, a lot of accounts, you have some in the book of how Muslims, many Muslims are in fact experiencing life in major European cities, and that is to say they're kind of ghettoized in these Islamic communities, and they're not experiencing the life of regular citizens and the opportunities they have because of leadership of their communities having been deferred to by the native leadership within a city or a country.
Yeah, and they are in fact the people who are suffering. I mean, the individuals within Muslim communities who are not able to exercise their rights as individuals. You know, some years ago there was a report being written about a ghetto in Malmö, Sweden, just across from Copenhagen, and the women in that report said, you know, we enjoyed more freedom living in the Middle East than we do in this ghetto in Sweden, because there was a religious police in the ghetto forcing them to wear, you know, headscarves, separating boys and girls when they were, you know, playing in the backyard, and so on and so forth. And I think that's outrageous. I mean, it's very, you know, the most important thing is to defend the right of the individual, and many Muslims are not able to exercise their rights within their community, be they women, you know, homosexuals, atheists, and they don't have a right to leave their group and join another group if that's what they want, because there is this notion, you know, you're born a Muslim and you can never leave the faith. If you leave the faith, we have a right to kill you. But the progressives, I mean, they don't pay attention to this very, very fundamental problem.
You dealt with in the book. You have this nice account, and I think this kind of fits in this line of conversation we're having. You go back and you meet personally with people who had threatened you and one of the cartoonists, if I recall correctly, Westergaard, whose cartoon seemed to be the one that really infuriated people the most. With the bomb and the turban of Mohammed, and what your account is these concrete characters, these people who had gone to Europe, and largely there's a failure of integration of some kind. There's a failure to accept duties and responsibilities of living in Denmark. In particular, I think of the one gentleman you characterize, you report on. And there's a sense of Islam, the kind of Islam they encounter gives them something. It's something they're missing. And I'd like to hear that. I think that's significant because, and I just keep thinking of the number of Muslims in Europe we're reading about joining the Islamic State or fleeing to fight for the Islamic State. And I just kind of wonder what would lead you to do that. And I think there's an emptiness that's somehow being filled. So I'll let you talk.
Yeah, that's very important. Thank you for that question. No, this was a young man. He was just 25 years old, and he came to Denmark from Tunisia. And when he came to Denmark, he was secular. He married a Danish girl. He went to Denmark. He learned the language. In fact, he speaks quite good Danish. At one point he was working, as a bodyguard in a discotheque, and he came into a fight, and he hit one man, I think, quite, severely, and he was sentenced, I think, to 3 months in prison. And when he came out of prison, he had big difficulties finding a job. He was going from application to application. He couldn't find a job. And then, he started. He was divorced. He had new girlfriends and so on and so forth. And basically, he ended up as a lost soul. And then he started to look for a new identity. He felt, an outcast in society in a way, and he started frequenting a mosque, where the local imam provided him with a real strong identity, basically saying, if you believe in this, you are superior to all the people, that do not want to offer your job, because you are part of the right belief, and all the others are infidels. And he started frequenting this mosque on a regular basis, and basically he was brainwashed, I would say, and he got involved with other people, and they started to plot, the killing of Kurt Westergaard, and they were stopped, fortunately, before they started to take action, and he ended up in prison, and I went, in fact, to prison and interviewed him there. And a few months later, in fact, he left the country. He didn't want to serve his prison term in Denmark, so I think maybe he went back to Tunisia or somewhere else in the Middle East. But it's a story about how the lack of identity and the struggle for finding an identity in the West for a lot of these young Muslims sometimes end, in this kind of stupid ways.
On this question of identity, I want to try and push on Europe here for a minute, and maybe that's too broad, but nations within Europe dealing with an influx of Islamic immigration or people who are Muslim immigrating into these countries. Is there a failure of Europeans to understand what they are about, or a lack of confidence, a bowing, overly bowing to a subservient tyranny of political correctness or things like that, and really a failure to understand what it is to be European, and that failure leads to an inability to propose anything to these immigrants, and then the immigrants, of course, fall back on what they know, or indeed, as you suggest, they become something else because they really don't know who they are in these new countries to them. So that's kind of a question that I've got in mind. And I think related to this is just what is the European Union about? What does it mean to be a part of the European Union? Are these sort of vague notions, tolerance, equality, all of these, does that really mean anything? What's it rooted in?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think the European Union and Europe is experiencing an identity crisis, and you can say that this identity crisis is being reinforced by the arrival of a lot of immigrants who belongs to another culture and another faith. And it is really forcing upon us to answer, this very fundamental question: who are we? To go back in history and explore, how Europe came about, what are the fundamental values, what's in our culture, and of course, one of the problems with the European Union is that it was basically, an economic commonwealth, but also with a political dimension. But it's very difficult to keep this kind of commonwealth together without a common culture and without strong values. So I think Europe needs to answer this question: who are we? And since the Second World War, the founding narrative of modern Europe has been the Holocaust, that we do not want a repetition of the Holocaust. And it's also founded of a specific reading of the Holocaust, which basically implies that evil words, that anti-Semitism will lead to evil deeds at some point. And I would beg to disagree with that. I don't believe that the Holocaust happened exclusively because of anti-Semitism, because if that was the case, you would have had a Holocaust in Germany in 1939. Hitler had been in power in 6 years. Or if you take, all the anti-Semitic pogroms throughout European history from the Middle Ages, until the middle of the 20th century, and compared to what happened during the Second World War, you will see that more people was killed during 1 week on the Eastern Front in 1942 than throughout the whole history of European pogroms, anti-Semitic pogroms. More Jews were killed in 1 week of 1942. So I think that the Holocaust happened. Of course, anti-Semitism was a factor, but it happened because two totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany and communist Soviet Union, clashed in Central and Eastern Europe, and they destroyed states, they destroyed cultures, they learned from one another, and they committed these mass killings. And if that is the case, then we would have to reinvent Europe, on the basis of an anti-totalitarian ideology, on an ideology based on freedom. And that would imply that we should not pass all these hate speech laws, because hate speech in and by itself do not lead to violence, and we do not fight hate by outlawing hate speech. And if you take the Muslims in Europe today, a lot of them are in fact Holocaust deniers. They do not believe that the Holocaust happened. They say that it's a conspiracy, it's a fantasy. But if you have laws in Europe criminalizing denial of the Holocaust, you will not be able to confront these opinions in the open. You will not be able to educate these people, because they will not air their opinions if they are outlawed, but they will not change their mind. They will just say, oh, the Europeans are trying to impose on us this conspiracy. So I really do believe that Europe has to reinvent itself on the basis of freedom, and first and foremost on the basis of freedom of religion and freedom of speech.
A very powerful argument. And of course, what you encountered in the aftermath were Muslims claiming that they were the new Jews in Europe, which fits what you're saying, I think, very well. That is to say, we should not be criticized, and we're being criticized, and so look who we are, and what's being said about us. Also, on this business of the
just one note more.
Sure.
I mean, if you go back in the 20s and 30s in Germany, the Jews, they were not enjoying the same rights as other people. They were not allowed to work as doctors and lawyers and teachers. They were not allowed to marry non-Jews. They were not allowed to go to parks, to beaches. And after 1935, they were also stripped of their citizenship. And nothing like that is happening to Muslims in Europe today.
No, that's right. You note that in the book as well, and making a very incredibly unbalanced comparison in that argument. On this question of hate speech laws, the amount of power that must be lodged in the state to, in effect, stamp out hate in quotation marks, that really does not end, and it invites ever more assertions of, or the state reaching in and not just stopping speech or penalizing speech, but in effect leading to a lot of self-censorship, and so a very denuded public square.
Yes, absolutely, and I mean the European Council, they identified 35 different definitions of hate speech. Of course, that implies that it's very difficult to define this, and who is to define what hate speech? I mean, there is this trend that we tend to treat radical right-wing hate speech in a far more aggressive way than we treat radical left-wing hate speech, even though, I mean, both kinds of ideologies are responsible for mass killings in the 20th century. And hate is, in some cases, a very legitimate, human emotion. And it is a basic human emotion that you cannot eradicate by outlawing it. I mean, it's like Orwell. Love is hate, peace is war. slavery is freedom. That if you just outlaw something, you will be able to create the world in your own image, and certain things will go away. But that is a very totalitarian approach to human life.
Yes, and leading to an alienation of large groups of citizens who are led to believe that they are in effect enemies of the ruling power or ruling ideology because something that is inside them is hateful, or indeed they don't take the arguments on, or they don't do the serious work of actually trying to be a member of a democracy, which requires you to, at some level, give voice. I want to talk, staying on this theme, relating these events, and the hate speech laws are a part of it, I think, to the success that we've seen recently, and we're 10 years from what we're talking about in the cartoons and their consequences, and we've seen the rise of these alternative populist political parties with success throughout the continent. And I don't mean to imply that they're full of bigots or full of hatred, but it's a different type of political party that we've seen. You've got center-right, center-left parties in every European country, but many would say not too much of a difference between them. Well, there is with these parties. So is this a sort of muscular political reaction to this sort of soft or hard even political correctness in Europe?
Absolutely. I think exactly you're putting it right. It is a reaction to the fact that the mainstream political parties for many years didn't want to confront these issues with immigration, with societies becoming more multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious, which many people welcome. I'm married to an immigrant myself, but it creates new challenges when you take in people with different cultures, with different backgrounds, and you have to work out, the rules of the game in order to, create a fair society. And out of political correctness, out of fear of being labeled racist, discriminating, the majority of mainstream politicians for many years didn't want to deal with these issues. But people who were living with these problems in their day-to-day life had this experience, that this is difficult. We don't like it. We would like to talk about it. We have to find solutions to these issues, and that paved the way for these new parties that they have been in business, I think, for 25, 30 years. But I think if you take the Danish People's Party, which is now the second or the third biggest party in Denmark, over the past 10, 15 years, they have moved to the center, and you would not call them anymore a right-wing populist party. They at one time they served as a parliamentarian foundation for a conservative government. And they would even be possible for them to cooperate with social democrats in Denmark, possibly in a government at some time. So I will not say that they are by definition on the fringes. And you have seen in a majority of European countries that now the mainstream parties, because of the popularity of these new parties, are beginning to confront these issues. But definitely, I mean, these parties arose as a reaction to the fact that the old parties did not want to confront important issues.
No, and I did not mean to suggest that these parties are on the fringes. I've actually written in favor of the United Kingdom Independence Party as I think being a positive development in the UK. And there are a lot of issues. It's not just immigration. There are just basic questions of sovereignty on the table with regard to the European Union. And indeed, I think the valid observation that the European Union in its present form and governance and structure is not leading to prosperity and to a thriving Europe. And maybe it's just the exact opposite. So yeah, I think good point there. I want to get your sense, and maybe you can speak descriptively and prescriptively, the future of Europe with regard to Islam. How do you see things now unfolding? Do you see signs of Islamic communities in various European cities and states being open to integration, or is there something else happening that's going on?
It's hard to say, which way this will lead. But I would say now there is a recognition among a majority of politicians in Europe that we do have a problem. I mean, there are still politicians who would like to deny it, but I would say that the vast majority, and also in the mainstream parties, they do recognize, there is a problem, because they can see it, with ghettos, they can see it with problems with schools, with people not entering the labor market, with all kinds of clashes, and so on and so forth. So there is a problem. I think the question is if the process already, has gone too far, that there are too many unintegrated people, there are too many ghettos, and things have gone out of hand. I mean,
You're saying a basic recognition that multiculturalism has failed.
Exactly.
Yes.
And even Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, the former French president, and the German chancellor, have said as much. And I think also David Cameron in the UK. Multiculturalism has failed in the sense that you accept the group as the fundamental unit in a democratic society, and that groups should have the right to live according to their own rules, no matter if they are in conflict with fundamental democratic values or not. And I think that is really a fundamental problem, and that we should insist on the necessity of communicating across group and challenging groups that do not live up to the fundamental values that our society is based on, and not label it as discrimination, racism, or whatever people do.
I want to end our discussion with maybe just an opportunity of reflection from you on the past 10 years, on how the cartoons changed your career, what you learned from that, because I imagine it must. I just, as I'm reading this, I'm trying to, inevitably I'm putting myself in your place, and I'm thinking, how would I react if something I wrote or had commissioned or published was, in some sense tied to the burning of one of my nation's embassies in a foreign country? That must have been a burden that you carried. And you talk about conversations you've had with ex-Soviet dissidents, dissidents within Islam, and people who have, formerly of that faith and left it. And all of the, you said you've been encouraged by those conversations, and you say very directly you did the right thing. So I guess here we are, end of 2014, and you look back. Anything you would have done differently?
Not much. I mean, there are some, minor things that I would have done differently, but on the main issues, I would say no. What surprised me was, in fact, that the support for free speech was not that much grounded in Western Europe. I was surprised that so many people could not see the implications of giving into this kind of intimidation. Yes. And I was surprised that a lot of people in Denmark and in Western Europe would call me a racist. I found that very intimidating and unpleasant. Talking to these Muslim dissidents, as I earlier talked to Soviet dissidents, made it very clear to me that these are, although they are not saying new things. I mean, it's all out there. They did not invent anything new, but the fact that you have people who do come from other parts of the world and who are willing to risk their lives for their right to speak their mind, because they do not have that right back at home. I found that very, very inspiring, and that's why I think people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali or Afshin Elian in the Netherlands, an Iranian, Mariam Nemezi, with whom I disagree, ideologically because she's on, the left, former communist, but she stands up for these fundamental values, women's rights, the right to criticize religion. That these people are in fact very inspiring. They put their lives on the line in order to defend, these values that I at the time thought were quite, ingrained in our society. But what I learned from over the past 10 years is that this is something you really have to fight for, and it's not self-evident to a lot of people that we have to defend also the right to offend. That in a democracy you cannot insist on having a special right not to be offended, and that is the price you have to pay for living in a democracy, because you enjoy so many rights in a democracy that you do not enjoy in a dictatorship. But you cannot enjoy this right not to be offended.
I think that is a great way to end. Flemming Rose, thank you for your work, for your courage,
thank you,
and for this book, The Tyranny of Silence. I appreciate your time today greatly.
And thank you for having me.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.